Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to do a video on books written about the Beatles. I've already done 3 videos like that a few years ago, but thought I'd reply to a video recently posted by the channel Pop Goes the 60s, I'm sorry. And Matt Williamson is behind that channel, and he put out an excellent video recently discussing a recent book which came out called The Beatles and the Historians, an analysis of writings about the Fab Four. And that author, I don't have that book, I'm on the lookout for it, I didn't know about it until I watched the video. He divides the writings into 4 categories: what he calls the Fab Four legacy, Lennon Remembers legacy, Philip Norman legacy, and the Mark Lewison legacy. So I can see where he's coming from, but I'm going to slightly rejig the classification of the books. I've got an awful lot of books on the Beatles. I don't plan to show them all to you, but I've got most of them out and divided them into the categories. And the 4 categories I've chosen is in their own words, meaning stuff written by them, and then as a kind of sideline from that, books written by insiders, people who are very close to the Beatles, and they're a kind of a mixed bunch, to be honest. Then the second category I've got is kind of historical fact-based books, which are invaluable, and I'll show you a few of those. And then third category is kind of analytical books trying to assess the impact of the Beatles' music and culturally and artistically, commercially, and there's an awful lot of those, and again a bit of a mixed bunch there. And then the fourth category is what I would call sensationalist books, where the author has deliberately taken an agenda and stuck to it and just presented a pretty one-sided account. And there's a few of those, although some of them I haven't picked up because I've refused to. So starting off with in their own words, the first category, and I think in many ways this is the most valuable category because it comes from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So included in that category I would include the authorized biography by Hunter Davis, which came out in '68. It was criticised at the time and a bit later by John as being a little bit sanitized and cut out all the what went on tour, etc. But I think it's a very decent effort because Hunter Davis spent an awful lot of time with each of the Beatles at their respective homes and witnessed some of the recording sessions for Sgt. Pepper, and it was written at the time. It was released before they split up, so it's not complete in that sense. Released in '68 before the White Album. But I find it invaluable, and Hunter Davis writes well. Controversially, we have Lennon Remembers, which was the famous interview he did with Jan Wenner. So Matt Williamson is saying that this book is written by the way, I did write down the author, but I didn't, sorry. This book, The Beatles and the Historians, takes this interview to task and said a lot of it is false and he was on drugs at the time and he didn't know what he was saying. But I find it invaluable because he may have changed his mind about some of the things he said. He may have downplayed Paul's role in the songwriting process, particularly in the early years. But it's a historical testament as to where his mind was at the time, and with the angst of the Beatles breakup and going into primal therapy, he was being extremely candid and trying to debunk the Beatles myth. And I think for that reason, I don't think this interview should be listened to in isolation, but as a kind of body of work from the Beatles. If you listen to interviews from them in the '60s, there's some good ones on the BBC Volume 2. The third disc is just interviews of them taken between Rubber Soul and Revolver, and very interesting contemporary interviews. And then if you look at their interviews throughout their career they may have changed their views, but it shows where they were at the time, and I think this is an invaluable document. And by the way, if you want to listen to Lennon Remembers, there is a podcast available on YouTube. You can listen to the whole damn thing, which I've done on several occasions. So in the same vein, the Beatles in their own words, this book collected quotes from It's Falling to Bits, the Beatles on the various songs, or there's a chapter on drugs, there's a chapter on politics, and you know, again, it's in their own words, so you can't really argue with it, even though they may have changed their views over the years. By the way, a point I'd like to make is the closer you are to the Beatles' years, i.e. the 60s, I think the more revealing the books are. And some of these latter-day books are a little bit revisionist, and I don't much like that. I think I prefer stuff which came out nearer the time. So this is another, it's not quite in their own words, but Anthony Fawcett, this was an authorised biography. Anthony Fawcett was John Lennon's personal assistant, and this is the book which has that famous September '69 tape where they discuss the follow-up to Abbey Road, which is fascinating. So absolutely invaluable, that book. And then this album, the Beatles tapes, David Wigg conducted interviews with each of the four of them around the time of the split. And I think George and Ringo tried to stop this album for some reason, saying, oh, they don't agree with what they said back then. But, you know, it shows that, you know, the split wasn't cast in stone, and, you know, George was talking favourably about the Abbey Road album and Paul's songwriting, and saying you can't split because if you're listening, I'm the walrus too. Ringo was saying maybe he's asked if is he the one to get the Beatles back together. He says no one of us can do that, but they always say that. Maybe it's because I'm so nice. And it's a very amusing, warm interview with Ringo. And they've got the famous one from John in '71, where he famously says, I told them 20 years ago I'm not going to be singing She Loves You when I'm 30. I was 30 last year, and that's when I broke the band up. So it's just absolutely invaluable. These are some 1980 interviews. Andy Peebles came out on CD in 1990. The Playboy interviews with David Sheff. This companion makes a nice bookend with Lennon Remembers. If you want to kind of listen to Lennon at the beginning of his solo career and at the end, unfortunately what was to turn out to be the end, it's very interesting to see the contrast in his mood, and he's a lot warmer towards Paul McCartney, for example, although not completely. He says a few derogatory things, but in general he's a more relaxed talking about the Beatles than he was during that Jan Wenner interview. This is George Harrison's closest he came to an autobiography, more just going over the songs and discussing the lyrics and the inspiration behind the songs, but and there's a short essay at the beginning which John Lennon was complaining he was not mentioned in, but it's invaluable, it's in George's words, and I wouldn't be without that. And the same goes for Postcards from the Boys from Ringo. This is a collection of personal postcards received by Ringo from Paul, George and John. And for example, there's one in 1971 where John just says, who'd have thought it would come to this? That's all he says, and that's in a reference to the court case, because Paul had just taken them to court to dissolve the partnership. So the Lennon Letters, again, this is edited by Hunter Davis. He collected all the Lennon letters over the years, dating from the 60s right up until 1980, and by hook or by crook, I'll be the last in this book, John Lennon. And I think this is fascinating because you can see the change of his mood throughout the 70s, and at some points he's willing to talk about the other Beatles in warm terms, in other letters he's not. So that's an invaluable collection. Now this is what you would think is the definitive history of the Beatles, because it's the Beatles in their own words. But unfortunately it was put together in 1995, and Lennon had been dead for 15 years, so the only stuff they've got from Lennon is archival material. And George and Ringo and Paul are interviewed, quite a long time after it happened, and I wouldn't say they've forgotten, but for example, if they're talking about Rubber Soul, it was 30 years ago from when they recorded these interviews, and I think people's memories play tricks on them, and in some cases they've sanitized the history. Again, there's no mention of not much mention of all the orgies and groupies that were part of the touring, and John's heroin addiction is virtually not mentioned at all. And when it comes to the split, they're being a little bit guarded about what happened and the arguments, and George is very much saying, oh, it was inevitable, we were going to split up, and we all know Abbey Road was going to be the last album. Well, that's not what comes across from interviews at the time from any of them. So it's interesting what hindsight does to one's recollection of things. Anyway, moving on to, let's cover the insiders, because there's a few of these, and some of them better than others. May Pang, who was John's girlfriend for a year and a half in the mid-70s, came up with this excellent Loving John book, where she recounts John's what he got up to in LA, recording Pussycats with Harry Nilsson, and back in New York recording Walls and Bridges, meeting up with David Bowie, meeting up with Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger. There's a lot of stuff in that book, it's excellent. Patti Boyd, Wonderful Tonight. Again, she was about as close as you can get, married to George for 8 years before they split. Didn't get divorced till 77, so they actually married for 11 years, and she's very candid in this book about a lot of things, including George's infidelities, which are quite upsetting to read about. What else have we got? Jeff Emmerich, who was the engineer on a lot of the Beatles albums, particularly Revolver, and then he left during the middle of the White Album. He was on Pepper and came back for Abbey Road, and this is an excellent book. The problem with these books is some of these insiders have their own perspective, and that book was criticised as being a bit anti-George, but on the whole I think it's invaluable and really well written, and he's a maestro in the studio, and was a lot of the reason behind some of the experimentation the Beatles got up to. So let's move on to the the historical fact-based books. So these two volumes here are well worn, almost falling apart. Neville Stannard, just where he goes through all of the Beatles releases and tells you, chart positions and musician credits, and he does the same for the solo years in this one, which is definitely falling apart. He's got a UK section and a US section for each Beatle. He's got pictures of picture sleeves, like Maybe I'm Amazed here from 77 when it was released as a single, and I just loved these books, and the same would go for the recording sessions. Mark Lewis, and I know he says that there's a few errors in it he's spotted since writing it. This came out in '88, but this goes through all of the Beatles sessions, and it's just one of the most fantastic Beatles books, because it tells you what they recorded on each day, for which album, etc. And then this was a similar volume which combined the recording sessions with the live shows, and again very well researched. Another book Lewison was involved in, but written with a couple of other people, Piet Schroeders and Adam Smith, is The Beatles London. Again, all this does is just show you the places that the Beatles hung out in the 60s by postal district, so you can look it up. It tells you which tube to go to, which is the nearest tube. It has little maps. It's just a wonderful book, and as Derek Taylor says in the foreword, you should have two copies of this, one for the library and one for when you go on the road. So I only have the one, and as you can see, it's a little battered, so I need to take Derek's advice and pick up a second copy of that. And then on the same, this is mostly fact-based stuff from Keith Badman, wonderful book documenting what the Fab Four got up to after the split, and there's another similar volume by him as well. So that was the historical ones, and then moving on to the analytical type stuff, and we got these two contemporary books came out in '77 at the height of Wings' popularity. Tony Jasper, Paul McCartney and Wings, excellent book. This released right in the aftermath of the Wings Over America tour, when they were on top of the world, literally. Similar book from Jeremy Pascal. Good pictures, good more or less contemporary views of what people thought of Wings at the time. This book from Nicholas Schaffner, really need to pick up another copy of this. This came out in '77 and covers the group years and the solo years up until '78, and wonderfully written, a lot of humour, and I would thoroughly recommend that book. It's in my top 5 Beatles books for sure, and then this is also in my top 5 by Cara Tyler, the Beatles Illustrated Record, and here they go through all of the albums and the singles, and then going on into the solo career, and they go right up until the first volume went up to, I think, Venus and Mars, and then they updated it to go up to Mull of Kintyre, and then they updated again after John's death, and this is the latest version going up to Double Fantasy. Got the Peter Doggett book, You Never Give Me Your Money, which a little bit focuses on the negative side, the squabbling and stuff, but very well written, very well researched. Unlike some Beatles books, this book tells you every quote, where it came from in each chapter, and that's how books should be written, and unfortunately some books are not written that way. Another book which I found, I'm not sure if this could be described as analytical or just a document of the making of a particular album by Ken Sharp, and the great thing about this book is he's not stating his own opinions, he's just interviewing all of the musicians and the engineers and the producer, Jack Douglas, and Yoko, and they present the bulk of this book. So there's no essay on what he thinks, it's what the musicians who were involved in making the project think, and I think that makes it more authentic, and I've always been a great admirer of that book. Ian McDonald, this is a little bit more analytical and subjective. He does state his opinions in here, and most of them are very well observed. Obviously some fans are upset with when he slags off certain tracks, such as Across the Universe, comes in for a deal of criticism, and he's a little bit harsh on some of McCartney's stuff like Maxwell, but on the whole it's well written, and I wouldn't be without this book, and it was quite revolutionary indeed when it first came out. And then you've got other sources like the Ultimate Music Guide, where you've got reviews of each album written now, so 50 years after the event, and for the most part they're well written, but I think I do prefer reviews written, closer to the time, like in this book, because I think they reflect what people felt, and the cultural impact, particularly in the Schaffner and the Cara Tyler book. One really gets a sense of what it was like to live through the 60s. And then I'm going to finish this review by just mentioning a few sensationalist books, which this could have been a good insider's account, because Peter Brown was pretty close to the Beatles, but unfortunately he presents a very one-sided picture, and Paul McCartney ended up burning this book on his bonfire. He's a little bit too anti-McCartney and anti-George for my liking, although it's pretty decently well written and some good stuff in there. I would take it with a pinch of salt. Geoffrey Gilliano, the notorious biographer of, certainly written books on Paul, George and John, and he well, Olivia Harrison's on record saying he only met my husband for 10 minutes, and George made the quotes that this guy knows more about my life than I do, and he meant it derogatorily, and Jeff has used it to plug his book here on the back. Geoffrey Gilliano tends to, and I think he admitted actually, he tends to be it tends to go towards the sensationalist angle, should we say, and I don't think it does him much credit. He said he made $9 million out of it, so, you know, well done him financially, but I think in terms of credibility, I think he's over the top, and I wouldn't take any of his books as particularly truthful, or in part they are, but in part they're exaggerated. And the same would go for Fred Seaman. He was John Lennon's assistant for a year and a half at the end. And reading this, you would think he was John's best buddy, and he's coming up with all these theories about John and Yoko's relationship. But again, I would urge you to take it with a pinch of salt. I don't agree with the sanitized version of the John and Yoko relationship either. I think theirs was a real marriage with real problems, and John was honest about it in interviews and on record on Double Fantasy. So the last book I want to show you, this is a bit of a joke book, The Walrus's Paw, and this whole book is dedicated to the conspiracy theories on the Paul is dead theory. And the only nugget of truth I got out of this book is the observation that the McCartney cover, supposedly there is an old English saying, life is a bowl of cherries. In this case, the bowl is empty. I thought that was quite a smart observation. But other than that, he includes the ridiculous rumours as well as the not so ridiculous or the unexplained, and it's quite an amusing book but quite dismissible. So that was a lot of books I showed you, and I just want to say that I tend to prefer the Beatles in their own words, although I love some of the books I showed you by outsiders, should we say, like Karen Tyler and Nicholas Schaffner. Also ought to like to mention Wilfred Mellor's Twilight of the Gods. I used to have a copy of that, came out in '73, which is analysing the musical side of the Beatles, but I've lost my copy, unfortunately. Wouldn't be without any of these books, particularly the in their own words stuff and the historical Lewison stuff, and Keith Badman, Peter Doggett. So yeah, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.